There are 7 people on Earth who control so much real estate that if you removed their properties from cities, entire neighborhoods will disappear. Not metaphorically, physically. Office towers, apartment blocks, shopping center, parking garages, gone. Every city has buildings you walk past without thinking about them. They feel permanent, like they belong there. Like they're part of the background, like they belong to the market, the city. But they don't. They belong to someone. And once you really start to notice, the question becomes impossible to ignore. How many of those buildings belong to the same few people? Because the answer is way fewer than you think. When people think about real estate power, they picture institutions like Blackstone, Brookfield, pension funds. That is not wrong, but it's incomplete. Because behind some of the largest private real estate portfolios on earth aren't funds, they're individuals who never sold. People who stayed quiet on purpose, kept control, and let time to do what time always does. To understand how this happened, you have to stop thinking of real estate as just buildings and start thinking of it as control over where life is allowed to happen. That's why every person on this list figured out independently in different countries under different conditions. In 7th place, let me introduce you to Stephen Ross with $17 billion in real estate. He didn't grow up wealthy. In fact, he started in tax law. His big win came not because he found cheap land. He won because he solved a problem that no one wanted to solve. For decades, Hudson Yards in New York wasn't just undeveloped. It was legally complicated. Rail yards was dead space. Unbuildable, unfinanceable, and politically complicated. Most investors avoid that kind of mess because it doesn't fit a spreadsheet. But Ross leaned into it. He spent years quietly assembling air rights, something that most investors don't even know could be owned. By acquiring air rights above New York rail yards, he turned it into one of the most valuable developments in the whole city. And that single insight reshaped Manhattan's West Side and became the foundation of his $17 billion real estate empire. But not many know that Hudson Yard almost never happened. Hudson Yards required over $5 billion in private capital before a single building rose. And in the early 2000s, banks walked away, politicians stalled, and the project was labeled as too complicated to finance. It actually stalled more than once. Ross personally had to guarantee billions because if the structure collapsed, everything collapsed. Manuel Wheeler. In Philippines, one of the largest real estate empires didn't start with luxury housing. It started with infrastructure. Meet Manuel Wheeler in 6th place. Manuel Wheeler didn't start in real estate either. He grew up poor. His early businesses weren't glamorous: gravel, concrete, and raw materials. In the Philippines, infrastructure dictates destiny. Roads decide where jobs go, where housing follows, and where commerce forms. So Wheeler paid special attention to public work plans long before the market did. When the Asian financial crisis hit in the late 90s and capital froze, other developments collapsed. Wheeler didn't retreat. He studied government infrastructure plans, followed them before they were funded, and bought land. If the road didn't come, the land that he bought would have been worthless, and his plans would have failed. But they didn't. His strategy was called boring by his competitors. That is until the population followed the roads exactly as he predicted. By aligning his development with inevitable population growth, Wheeler built residential communities and malls worth roughly $17 billion. In place number 5, Harry Triguboff with $19.1 billion. Harry Triguboff's defining trait isn't aggression, it's refusal. He built Manhattan apartment by apartment, tower by tower, and then did something developers are culturally trained not to do. He did not sell. Triguboff's strategy sounds boring. It was considered wrong because most developers sold in boom after boom, yet he didn't. He's also famously blunt, famously private, and famously uninterested in exits. He celebrates holding. For decades, while others sold apartments at peak prices, he kept them, even when the market begged him not to. Not because he was stubborn, because he understood repetition. He didn't chase growth. He stood where growth had no alternative. And this patience shows up again in a much quieter way. One building becomes 10, 10 becomes thousands, thousands become a machine. Through Meriton, Trigger-Dolph built more than 75,000 apartments, now valued at roughly $19.1 billion. Nothing flashy, nothing loud, just relentless accumulation. Dan Bren is one of the richest real estate owners in America and holds fourth place on our list with $19.2 billion. Yet most people wouldn't even recognize him in the room. And that's not accidental, it's philosophical. Early in his career, Brand watched developers get rich and then lose everything chasing the next deal. What stuck with him wasn't the upside, it was the fragility. So he made a decision most investors would never tolerate. He optimized for permanence, not returns. In the 1990s crash, Brand nearly lost everything. Instead of doubling down on growth, he froze. He understood that rushing cost control, and when demand returned, Brand didn't chase it. It had just nowhere to go. But he knew that if you could control how people live, work, commute, and shop, you don't chase demand, you manufacture it. And through Irvine Company, Brand controls roughly 120 million square feet of apartments, offices, retail, and land, all valued at roughly $19.2 billion. The Irvine Company doesn't flip, it does not syndicate, it doesn't sell to recycle capital. Brand keeps assets so long that people forget they even had a different owner. And what's fascinating is how boring his edge is. He controls land near employment centers, and he plans decades ahead. He removes alternatives rather than competing with them on price. But here's the human cost. This strategy requires saying no to liquidity for decades. Brand passed on generational windfalls because selling would have broken control. That takes restraint that most people just don't have. And in third place, and $23 billion in real estate asset, is Stan Kroenke. Kroenke understood something deeply unfashionable. Cities always expand, but they expand slowly. And his genius is that he refused to confuse activity with progress. While others, they optimized for NOI, he accumulated land, the one asset that does not need to perform quarterly. His portfolio looks inefficient on paper until you realize one thing: it is structured around optionality. He owns 2.7 million acres of land, more than anyone else in the United States, plus major commercial real estate and sports venues. Estimated value: $23 billion. Buying land early looks stupid until it isn't. He ignored mockery, he ignored timelines, and when expansion arrived, he already owned the ground. While buildings depreciate, land doesn't. It just waits. And when cities expand eventually, whoever owns the ground beneath that expansion doesn't need to predict the future. They'll just let it arrive. In second place, and $24.4 billion is Lee Shao-Kee. Lee Shao-Kee's story isn't flashy, and that's exactly why it's dangerous to underestimate. He came from modest beginnings and built wealth in Hong Kong, one of the most politically and spatially constrained cities on earth. He lived through multiple market collapses and learned the hardest lesson early: moving fast feels smart until the market turns. Lee lived through crashes before the people who rushed to build, rushed to sell, or rushed to recycle capital, and they were the only ones who got wiped out. Speed didn't save them, it actually exposed them. So Lee, he did the opposite. He slowed down. He bought land and then he just sat down and waited. Even when waiting just looked inefficient, even when it tied up capital, even when others told him that he was wasting time. He treated land like a long-dated option, not an asset to monetize quickly. This means enduring long periods where the capital looked inefficient. Analysts, they criticized him for sitting on land instead of selling it. Lee Shao-Kee is often called a Warren Buffett of Asia, not because he traded well, but because he waited well. While others, they recycle capital, he accumulated land. And in a city where there is almost nowhere left to build, land doesn't just appreciate, it decides what gets built next. And when that happens, well, the payoff is huge. Through Henderson Land, Lee controls roughly $24 billion in real estate across Hong Kong and mainland China. And in our first place, meet Dan Gilbert with $30 billion in real estate holdings. Dan Gilbert didn't just get into real estate because he loved buildings. He got into it because he hated being dependent on everyone else's decision making. Early in his career, Gilbert built Quicken Loans into a mortgage machine. But what most people don't realize is that the 2008 crisis nearly wiped out his credibility overnight. Mortgage CEOs were radioactive. The press hated them, regulations distrusted them, banks didn't want exposure. So Detroit wasn't his passion project, it was his counterpunch. When in 2009, downtown Detroit felt abandoned and banks left, investors left, the whole city felt like a ghost town, Dan saw an opportunity. Gilbert understood that the only way to change the momentum when the city was half empty was to own enough of downtown that he could force it. So he started buying towers, residential buildings, retail, parking, bought entire blocks through Rock Ventures. He moved thousands of his employees downtown when it was deeply unpopular. He overpaid for assets that everyone else was terrified to touch. And for years, he looked reckless. Detroit's recovery didn't come quickly, and during that period, Gilbert absorbed massive carrying costs, public criticism, and internal pressure. Today, his Detroit portfolio alone is estimated at over $30 billion, spanning tens of millions of square feet. That insight here is uncomfortable but powerful. Sometimes the only way to de-risk a city is to become that risk. Well, by now, the pattern is clear. These owners didn't win by being louder, faster, or more visible. They focused on 4 things: scarcity, time, control, and inevitability. They didn't trade real estate or speculated on prices. They positioned themselves where growth had no alternative. You walk through places like this. You just didn't know that someone designed the outcome. Because once you stop seeing cities as just skylines and start seeing them as layers and layers of ownership, a lot of things suddenly make sense. And once you see the cities this way, America stops looking accidental. If you want to know more about who controls America and real estate, drop your comment below and we'll send you more info. See you next time.